Thanks to everyone who joined us today. This is Circle Back, our monthly conversation series where we unpack institutions and how they shape individuals and work cultures. I'm Shambhavi. I'm a strategist at Gender at Work India. Last month for Circle Back, we spoke about care in the workplace with Bhavna Isar. You can find that discussion on our YouTube and Linktree as well. And the focus of today's conversation will be on inclusive leadership. What does the term entail and how can we strive for it at the workplace? Is it important to have inclusive leadership? We're so happy to be joined by Dr. Zubin Mulla. He is a professor at the School of Management and Labor Studies at TIS. Prior to joining academics in 2005, he worked in engineering design and management consulting for 7 years. His areas of research interest include transformational leadership, values, impact of Indian cultural beliefs on organizational behavior, and more. Thanks a lot for joining us, Dr. Mulla. We also have with us Sudarsana Kundu. Sudarshana is the Managing Trustee of Gender at Work India. She's passionate about supporting institutions both within the private and public sector to drive a diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. Over the last 2 decades, she has advised several organizations, including several UN agencies, to evaluate and assess the impact of their workplace policies, practices, and culture on gender equality. Thank you to you both for joining us. I would also like to spotlight our Indian Sign Language interpreters, Saurav and Preeti, who will be interpreting the session for us as we go along. And just to make their job a little easier, I would request the speakers to keep a conversational pace while talking. And without further ado, I would like to just quickly do our privilege acknowledgement, whereby we take a minute to acknowledge and understand that this space has a lot of value, this space whereby we can have these conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's important to recognize that all of us come from different locations and different positionalities. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Sudarshana.
Thanks, Shambhavi, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Zubin, it's such a privilege to have you here today. Clearly, from the chat box, so many people have joined us today just to have the opportunity to listen to you one more time. So, thank you. We often have practitioners in our circle back conversations, and so today with you are joining us to deepen our understanding of inclusion, drawing from your extensive research and academic grounding. I'm sure we'll get a very different insight and perspective into this discourse on diversity inclusion. So let me start by asking a very broad question. What do you understand by the term inclusion?
Thanks, Sudarshana. Thanks, Shambhavi, for the introduction. Thank you for having me. It's always wonderful to connect. And it's always great to see some of my previous students. Before we start, I just want to highlight that my area of research is primarily leadership, transformational leadership, moral leadership. And inclusive leadership lies at the intersection of 2 disciplines. One is my own, which is leadership. And the second is the whole literature on diversity and inclusion. And while preparing for this, I had to kind of, stretch out of that area to, look at the intersection. And I'm thankful to you for that, for making me, step a little bit out of that comfort zone. So my understanding of inclusion kind of arrived after we started talking about diversity, when we tried to get individuals who are not from the mainstream segments into the workplace. And then the question was that how do we make sure that we simultaneously satisfy 2 needs? One is the need for uniqueness, and one is the need for belongingness, so that people can bring their whole selves to work and at the same time get the feeling of being at home. And that, to me, is inclusion, where we try to get that optimum balance between celebrating the uniqueness of each individual and at the same time making everybody feel part of a larger group where they're engaged in an activity together.
You know, Zubin, you talked of drawing from two facets of your research, right? One, you talked of the facet of looking at your own work on leadership, your work, especially around moral leadership. I know with that, looking at some of those questions are very important in terms of the work that you've been doing. A lot of our, uh, 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 some of our, maybe not a lot, but many of our theoretical constructs that we draw as from researchers uh, are located in very different contexts. If you look at what we see in India, do you think there is a difference in how we should understand inclusion?
Yes. So one is at the straightforward at the level of diversity. What are the kinds of diversity that we look at? And there again, India has several unique forms of diversity. Like, for example, we have caste, we have the rural urban, we have something which is very, visible to us every time about, English speaking versus people who do not come from an English speaking background and do not sound similar to us, which often is a very salient difference and can be the basis for all kinds of discrimination in the workplace and elsewhere. So these are some very specific categories in our Indian context, which we need to recognize and incorporate into our understanding of diversity and inclusion. The second area is about how we go about addressing it. Now, one of the ways of addressing it is, put in place procedures and rules, etc. And another way is to look at somewhere into our own ethos and see whether there are certain principles from our own ethos which can be leveraged in order to deal with the challenge of inclusion in an organizational context. And I think that's an area where we need to really look at what is valuable in our ethos and culture, see what can be leveraged in order to harness it in the service of diversity and inclusion, and whatever is not suitable for today's time, to put it aside. One of the other things that we need to be super cautious about in the Indian context, which is also true for countries like China, is that we need to stop or we need to prevent ourselves from getting into paternalism. It's very easy for this diversity, inclusion, and other such initiatives to then slide into paternalism, which comes very naturally to us. So that is something that we need to guard against. So we need to find the right balance of care and concern for people with different identities. At the same time, we need to ensure that we don't fall into paternalism, which is going to be a tough act, and we need to find the way to do it.
You mentioned ethos. In terms of the ethos, and therefore, one of the in our work that we do on diversity and inclusion in the workplace, we see that the leadership plays a very different, defining role in that, because they are the ones who kind of, in some ways, define the ethos, the value systems of the organization. How would you kind of what are some of the characteristics of inclusive leadership that you see from your work, from in your interactions with organizations
So see
and the
this.
research that you're doing? Yeah.
Yeah. So this term inclusive leadership, the first instance that I have seen in the literature started somewhere in the early 2000s, where the definition was very straightforward. Anything that a person in a position of high authority, that is anything that a senior manager does, which fosters the cause of inclusion, is called as inclusive leadership. Now, obviously, this is a kind of a tautological definition,
Right.
and does not serve much purpose. But then right from the last 20 odd years, people have been exploring this in more detail. And the most recent definition, which was given in 2022, where they kind of looked at all the work that was done on inclusive leadership and they put it together. And they said it encompasses 4 dimensions. The first dimension talks about fostering uniqueness, wherein you support the different employee identities, promote diversity, empower the employees, contribute to their learning and development and growth. The second aspect of inclusive leadership talks about strengthening belongingness, make people feel part, make them feel at home, make them believe that they belong to a particular group or an environment. The third one is about showing appreciation. Now, the first two are at an individual level, where you foster their uniqueness, try to ensure their belongingness. When you talk about appreciation, it's about celebrating achievements in a public forum, which is where the individual and the group comes in. And the last one is at an organizational level, where create and support initiatives at the organizational level to increase inclusiveness. That is where you come up with your systems and processes and so on. So the first two are part of celebrating uniqueness and strengthening belongingness, which is anyways part of the what we understand by inclusion. The next is about giving appreciation, and the last one is about creating processes and systems to foster inclusiveness in the organizational context. So this is how inclusive leadership is defined in the literature. My own understanding, if I were to bring the transformational leadership, moral leadership dimension over there, is transformational leadership is all about changing followers for the better. So in a sense, it's all about bringing out the inherent potential in the followers, making them manifest their best selves. And I look at it in this way that, let us say a person belongs to a diverse group and is being assimilated into the organization. Inclusive leadership is about enabling that individual to express his or her best self at work. And we should not miss out on the other group, that is the mainstream group, because our objective is not to alienate any group. We need to get people to work together. And we also want individuals to work with each other. So individuals who are being included and individuals who belong to the mainstream who are already in the system, we do not want any resentment, because those are the micro interactions on a day-to-day basis which the person has to live with. And I think helping those individuals who are already within the system, who are so-called privileged, to also deal with the entry of a different kind of individual into their environment and rise to their best selves, where they become allies, enablers, and supporters to the new group. And I think that is the highest, that is what leadership is all about, helping people to manifest their best selves at work.
There's so much to it, and one can keep, discussing this, I'm sure. I mean, because this is your work and this is the research that you do. But, how do you one of the challenges one sees, right? And see, there are two dimensions to it. Is, as you said, making sure that the ones who are already privileged, how do you make sure that they're also allies? But for those who are coming in, right? Uh, first thing that you talked about is retaining uniqueness, right? How do you ensure that you retain uniqueness? For example, in the good old days when we started work, there was a lot of focus on, homogeneity of culture. Like, the culture has to be very similar. Everybody has to have the same ethos. Everything has to be centered around certain things. How do you ensure that there is uh, a harmonious sort of work culture, that people, as you said, get along, work together, but at the same time that you're able to retain identity?
So there are broadly three elements to it. One is, of course, the behavior of the people in positions of authority, which we often use the term leadership to describe. The second is the climate and the culture that you create in the system. And that's where, people have been talking about things like psychological safety. Are people able to speak their minds? Are people able to, express themselves fully? So providing opportunities, showing role models of individuals who have spoken their mind, allowing people to express themselves fully. And the third is at the level of systems and practices. Now, the systems and practices can start at the most basic level, where it comes to, things like preventing discrimination in the workplace, ensuring a basic climate of safety, making sure everybody feels safe. So just in today's newspaper, there's an article about a harassment case in a well-known multinational firm, which has got several awards and is well known for its diversity and inclusion practices. At the same time, in that kind of an organization, there are people who experience harassment. Now, these are things which are non-negotiable, very basic things, ensuring a climate of safety and security. The second level is to try to commit resources to these initiatives, educate people about the need for these initiatives and how to be an ally for them and include them in their day-to-day work. Also, designing elements of the value proposition and the rewards to make it easy for people to join and make it easy for people to thrive in the system. So what are the
Right.
kinds of elements of the total rewards, the benefits, the well-being initiative, flexibility, and so on.
Right.
And finally, also measuring it on an ongoing basis, whether we are doing well or not.
Right. Right. There's a lot of, you kind of worked on transformational leadership, and you said that one of the roles of the leader is to make sure that it is kind of bringing the best out, right? How does a transformational, therefore, and possibly an inclusive leader, what are some of the challenges that an inclusive leader may face within the workplace, within the organization? How do you think, what can they do to overcome those? Like a new organizational leader who's very well intended to kind of make sure that the organization is inclusive. What kind of you know challenges do you think they might face, and what can they do to really make sure that their vision gets translated?
So one of the challenges is about the biases that people have. Now, it's easy to say that they are biases and to get rid of them, but it's very easy to say it, very difficult to do it, because these biases
Mm,
are so deeply rooted in our system. They're
mm,
part of our evolutionary baggage. They were formed to make our life easy and prevent us from thinking every time we saw danger and to kind of prep us to deal with it. So these are some things
correct.
which are very deeply rooted in us, and it takes time and effort in order to overcome those biases. But it's possible to do that as human beings. Second is that the way some of these issues are presented and framed, there is often seen as a tension between short-term performance pressures,
Mm,
cost pressures, and
right.
goals of diversity, inclusion, and other things. So these are often seen in opposition.
Mm,
Now, this is something that managers need to grapple with. We've done it for CSR. We've done it for
mm-hmm,
environment very well. We
mm,
need to start using that same kind of thinking when it comes to D&I as well. And I'll
right.
talk a little bit about how to do that. So the
Right.
second issue is that we see these two things as opposition.
Mm,
The third thing is that we need to be prepared for new forms of diversity beyond the obvious. Uh,
mm,
Example which comes to my mind, in 2017, there was an employee from Google who
mm-hmm,
spoke up against the company's diversity initiatives. And
mm-hmm,
he was sacked for his views.
mm-hmm,
Now, we need to also keep in mind, and currently what is happening in the US universities,
mm-hmm,
where there is a tension between
mm-hmm.
different kinds of diversity. So these are things that I think leaders need to be prepared for.
Right.
Now, how do you deal with these things? So when we
Right.
talk about two competing pressures, uh, the way to deal with them is to try to cultivate what is called as a paradox mindset, where we try to frame every issue not as an either or, but as a
Mm-hmm,
both and.
mm-hmm,
And as I said, in the environment, it's been done quite well, where organizations which are sensitive towards environmental concerns and sustainability,
mm,
when they launch a product, when they come up with a new factory, both
mm,
these things are put as a goal. And when you're forced to think in terms of both and not either or, you do come up with creative solutions. We've seen that in the case of Paul Polman at Unilever is a good
mm,
example of how he was
mm,
able to achieve both these goals rather
mm,
successfully.
mm,
I think the other thing that leaders need to do is that so Ronald Heifetz at Harvard talks about what is called as adaptive challenge versus a routine emergency.
Mm-hmm.
A routine emergency is something in which the organization has standard algorithm set. Let
Mm-hmm.
us say somebody criticized the organization in the press. They have an algorithm set. The lawyers will go after them. They'll have a PR firm who will deal with it. They have several other steps which they will follow in order to deal with the so-called attack that has come into the organization. An adaptive challenge is one which requires change from within. It's like a person who has been diagnosed with diabetes and needs to make a complete lifestyle change in order to
Right.
deal with the challenge. It's not something where, passing a rule or coming
Mm-hmm.
up with a set of guidelines or
Mm.
passing an executive order will solve the problem. And I
Right.
think the DNI thing fits squarely in the area of an adaptive challenge.
Right.
Now, the mistake that organizations do is they read some of these consultant reports where they see best practices from this place, that place. They came up with paternity leave. I'll also come up with paternity leave. They came up with
Right.
something else. They designed a creche. I'll also design. I mean, they'll come up with all these things which others are doing. And that's also necessary and good. But
Mm.
without doing anything else at the ground level, which
Mm.
is where you find all kinds of insidious things happening that
Mm.
the person has availed of his or her rights that,
Mm.
and then after that there is a backlash from the colleagues in the workplace.
Right.
So over a period of time, the message goes that look,
Mm.
this policy is there on paper, but
Mm.
if you really care about your career, then this is not to be availed of. Or
Right.
if you leave early, then people are going to make comments about it.
Right.
So I think when you look at it as an adaptive challenge, the
Mm.
first thing that you realize is that you don't have the answers,
Mm.
because this requires the willing cooperation of a
Mm.
group of thinking, intelligent human beings.
Mm.
And if you don't enroll the support of those thinking, intelligent human beings in your
Mm.
challenge,
Mm.
however difficult and long term it may be, you're not
Mm.
going to be able to reach a sustainable solution. You'll have a band aid solution. You may win a few awards here and there, but at the
Mm.
ground level, the experience of those individuals whom you seek to empower will
Mm.
not change substantially.
Mm.
So I think that leaders who wish to further the diversity and inclusion agenda need to have an honest conversation, not one, but several, at several levels in the organization, and try to engage with people at different levels of the organization.
Mm.
Try to have these open conversations where people can speak freely. So when we say bring your whole self to work,
Mm.
uh, perhaps we should encourage even the bigoted self to come to work so that that expression of that bigotry comes out and we can
Mm.
engage with that person. Otherwise, it just gets suppressed and then
Mm.
later on it will manifest in other forms.
Right. Right.
So have those open conversations, have those persuasive conversations, think about what works for you, what kind of appetite your organization has, at what speed and at what pace and in what form and in what manner we want to move ahead with this D&I agenda,
Right.
and
Right.
then co-create that. I know it's going
Right.
to be very difficult, extremely expensive, perhaps, because it's going to take a lot of meeting and time and all that. But I feel if an organization is serious, this is likely to yield better benefits, maybe slower, but more sustainable.
Right. No, and as you know, Pallavi on one of the participants today said that you've nailed it. Often the question that we get asked quite a lot of times is, there's so much pushback, right, in terms of the policies that you've rolled out or things that you've started. There is no real political will within the organization to take it out. And the questions we get asked all the time, how do we do it, right? So you've talked of one is to have kind of create a space, an open space, a space for dialogue, a space for conversation. Make sure that you're kind of actually willing to listen to everyone and everyone, and be true to that uh, self, about being authentic around that I'm going to be able to listen to everyone. Well, what other ways that this adaptation, and what are some of the modes of adaptation that you've seen maybe in other organizations, and especially around BNI, that you've seen done well, and what could be some of the principles? I mean, again, and you said every organization is different, and not everything will fit. Everyone will have to see for themselves as to what works for them. But what are some of the things that you principles that you've seen that people could think about?
So I haven't seen this happening in the context of DNI, but I have read about a case and I have seen something happening in other contexts, and
Right.
perhaps it could be adapted here as well. So one is in the case of Johnson and Johnson when they set up their credo. The CEO at that time actually went from location to location talking to people about, okay, who is important to us? To what extent should we prioritize customers over employees, employees vis-a-vis shareholders? And they had those long conversations after which they came up with their famous credo, which then actually helped them in several other challenges when they faced. The other thing which I had the opportunity to be part of in my consulting days was when corporations were preparing for the onslaught of international competition. So we had this protected economy, and suddenly we were liberalized and we had a lot of competition coming in. And the concept of quality or quality management, self-managed teams was something which was not very familiar to Indian organizations. And the organization that I worked with did a lot of work in that area where they had to actually go to the people and convince them about the need for quality, the need for world-class processes. And it was difficult. There were several people who had past grievances which came up. There were other issues of inequities which had to be addressed. Uh, but companies did that successfully using these kind of approaches of adaptive leadership.
In terms of the allyship, because one of the things that you kind of mentioned, right, even if you've not seen it in the context of DNI, you mentioned some climate change, and like DNI in a way, climate change is also a very complex issue, right? And you've talked about how organizations are actually doing, using not as an all but an and kind of a conceptualization to take that forward. How are you seeing this sort of getting people buying into that kind of visioning, and here, and especially in the context of DNI, how do you strengthen allyship, especially for communities which are traditionally, people from communities that are in the context of India in particular, which are traditionally marginalized, right? Which you don't have, who may not find the voice otherwise, right? How do you kind of strengthen that kind of allyship?
I think one of the couple of things can be done. One is that more exposure to individuals. Very often, when we look at the way we are brought up, uh, we go to school in a segregated environment. I don't think our schools are as diverse as they need to be. So we have the right to education, where schools are supposed to be diverse on paper, but practically that doesn't happen. We go to elite colleges where we have a section of a certain section of the society coming in. Then we enter the workplace and suddenly we say that now we have to follow a diverse agenda. So it's not going to be easy for people. So one of the things that organizations need to do is to start, getting people to say their stories, people from the marginalized group, to start talking about their stories, and people of the mainstream group to be exposed to those stories and experiences. Because something that you're not, something that you've never seen, or some people whom you've never interacted with, you'll have all kinds of preconceived notions about that, about them. But if you know more about them and you've interacted with a couple of them, then it becomes very easy to recognize that they're just like you. There may be some superficial differences, but otherwise there are several similarities, and you can work very well with them. So I think providing those opportunities and that time for that interaction to happen, exposing them to stories and role models of members from all groups, so that they recognize the kind of struggles that those groups have faced, so that kind of empathy and understanding comes in. I think that would help. So to that extent, some of these kind of processes and rules which force a certain number of people from the uh, marginalized group into the organization would help, because working with those people, you kind of get more empathy and understanding of them, to get to know their life stories and so.
Right. And I think that will be some questions around that as I see the chat box already. But uh, one of the things, and especially because we work around thinking about social justice, we work around thinking about equity a lot, right? Uh, the question of being a moral leader kind of also comes up in the sense that uh, uh, for us, in a way, the moral leader, the ethical leader is also always thinking of sort of what does it mean to have an equitable kind of an organization that is striving for social justice, right? In the context of D&I, right, and in the context of an inclusive leadership, how do you think organizational leaders can retain that moral leadership?
So, as I mentioned earlier, one is themselves being a role model. Second is taking steps to ensure that the climate is such in which you're constantly working with members of both groups, the marginalized group as well as the mainstream group, to uh, work with them, change their mindset. And the third is processes, to put in place systems and processes where certain things are absolutely not acceptable, and then put in some resources also. So one of the things that organizations are looking at these days is in terms of providing a budget for ensuring pay equity. Many
Hmm.
historical, inequities in the system, and
Right,
going through it with a fine-tooth comb, trying to identify those inequities, and then it's going to cost money. So you've got to, put that money in to ensure that those past inequities get dealt with. Also,
right.
sharing your pay ranges at the time of recruitment, which
Hmm.
is necessary in order to ensure that pay equity is there. Because pay is one of the most important aspects when
Hmm.
people perceive fairness in the system. So I think being a role model, making sure that the climate and the culture is positive for members of all groups, and putting in place systems and processes which are fair to all. Some of them may cost money. All these three are important.
And Zubin, in terms of you work with a broad range of organizations. Are you seeing this in terms of very broadly? What are you seeing in terms of a trend? Are you seeing some interesting moves or initiatives that are being taken within organizations? Where are you seeing the India and DNI in terms of moving?
So I haven't had the experience of being first-hand part of any DNI, but if I look at some of the consultant reports where they talk about great organizations to work with and best organizations for women, etc., there seems to be some progress. It's not very fast. Uh, I think people are putting the nuts and bolts and the infrastructure in place.
Hmm.
So they are reporting that we now have this policy, we now have that
Right,
policy.
right.
Frankly, I've also seen some companies reaching out saying that we want anti-bias training, bias removal training and so on. So to that extent, it is there. But I have not seen the kind of engagement that would be required if it were, to be totally culture change from within. And it may
Hmm.
be happening and I'm not aware of it. But
Hmm.
I wish there were more of that, where you're engaging with people and having these frank conversations.
Yeah, yeah. We were, I don't know if people, there's an organization called World Benchmarking Alliance, and they do a lot of studies around looking at organizations. They've come up with a second global report, and they've looked at about 1,006 companies. So even in terms of policies, they found, and this may not be as true for India, but we're also trying to do some of that work, that only less than 7%, or it's about 7% of the companies globally actually adhere to ILO's mandated maternity leave, which is about 14 weeks, right?
Right.
Only 7%. And these are the top 1,006 because these are the most influential. So even just in terms of, policy and the groundwork, in our experience, we're still seeing that being just set up and structured and all of that. And
I think the US is an important outlier in that, right? They don't have
a
any.
very, 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 and an important outlier and an important influencer, therefore, because a lot of the bigger uh, companies, a lot of our, transnational companies are situated, housed in the US, and those kinds of ways of looking at it in terms of whether there are policies around maternity care, overall care, and even in terms of non-discrimination, all of that is kind of, very influenced by their own policies. So that's definitely been a challenge. But I think maybe this is a good time to really open up to the audience and see what questions they have. You know, all of you've kind of expressed such an interest in speaking to Dr. Mulla. So we'd love to hear from you. What are some of your questions that you'd want to ask?
I'll just read out the question that Ishma has written. Ishma asks, as a middle manager facing the people on the front line, how does one navigate the challenge of bridging the dissonance of staying true to the DEI philosophy and parallelly driving diversity targets set by the leadership?
Ishma, this is a tough thing to do at the frontline level because your resources are limited. I think it may be a good idea for you to have some stories of individuals who have gone through adversity and succeeded and benefited not just their own career, but also their organization. Because once people are more easily convinced by stories rather than arguments, especially at frontline level. So I would suggest you try to arm yourself with stories, not just within your context, but from other contexts as well. And try to use those stories to persuade people about the need for this. And I guess that would work.
I would also like to ask you, Dr. Mulla, there's often this disconnect between, like Ishma said, certain values and how we're able to bring them into practice at the workplace. So as far as leadership is concerned, how can we make sure that the leadership also has this sense of responsibility to look inwards and to figure out ways to enable better practices maybe like one way that you spoke about was the open door practice or letting people share experiences. But beyond that, how can we make sure that the leadership is more responsible and more accountable?
So I'll just add one thing. So very often, I'll give you an kind of a hypothetical example. Very often students who are working with organizations in either their summer project or any other internship, they're given this project that we need to bring in diversity in the sales staff. And this will be a pharma company or an FMCG company. And they realize that there are very few women in the workforce in that pharmaceutical or FMCG company, and they want to increase diversity there. So the student follows a standard template, will make a list of all the colleges that are there. And if there are any women only colleges, then those will rank high because obviously you go and recruit from there, you'll get all women and puts it in place. But when we speak, we realize that at the ground level, the sales role, there is a certain cultural and an infrastructural challenge. And that cultural and infrastructural challenge has not been addressed, which is why even the women who have been joining will, quit within a few years. So understanding the world of the incumbent who is going to join and what she is going to go through once she joins is not done enough. So it's like a checkbox item that the top management wants to, say that, okay, this is something that we've done. We've identified colleges, we've gone to them and we recruited so many women. But that end-to-end understanding of, is there an adequate infrastructure? Is it going to meet the aspirations of that individual? Is it going to be a meaningful job for that person throughout that person's career or for a certain portion of time? And most important is, are the existing networks and individuals willing to accept a woman in their environment? And very often that can be the most painful, not being part of that the informal groups and cliques. You may do everything else, but not to them. And I think this is where people who are at the front line, who are doing these kind of projects, need to be the whistleblower or the conscience keeper and shake up the top management and say that it's not enough that you have told me to do this project. You need to put some resources into the system. You need to put a little bit of yourself into the system, come and understand the things, have that conversation. Because as an HR person, I'm still an outsider. They can always say that, look, you don't understand sales. this is not the way sales can be done. But if you are the head of sales, then come in there and have a conversation with those salespeople. Listen to what they have to say. Address the infrastructural issues, address the cultural issues. And as a role model, chances are they will listen to you more than they'll listen to the HR person. I think that is where the person at the front line who's implementing these policies can be the conscience keeper and the whistleblower and shake up the top management to get them to commit more of themselves, their time, and their resources to this initiative.
Thanks for that. Let's take one more question and then we'll come back to the others. Tanvi asks, what are some interventions that can be done to remove the feelings of victimization by the privileged groups, for example, men? If you're looking at taking initiatives to women, how can we remove those feelings of victimization?
So I think we should ensure that those feelings don't come in. And in my view, the best way to ensure that those feelings don't come in is to make the solution co-created with the existing employees in the firm. So rather than you come up with a solution, implement it, and then deal with the feelings of victimhood, share the issue that you're trying to deal with. That means you want to have more women in the workplace in a particular role. Share this with the people in the front line. Have a conversation with them. Identify what additional resources need to be put in. Identify with them what are the steps to be created so that they are partners in your project and they are not adversaries.
Zubin, the point here, though, often we see that, where there's a privilege, people want to retain that privilege, right? If you're the privilege is the dominant, right? And you say, oh, fine, but we will want to have more women, right? The privilege shifts, there is a, even if it is a not explicit, but there's an implicit kind of maybe a resistance to that privilege being challenged. And how do you address that?
No, I agree with you. It's not easy what I'm saying. It's
Yeah.
not easy because people are entrenched and they have deep-seated belief systems. Maybe this is not a convincing answer, but I think having that conversation is better than not having that conversation. So it is possible that you have that conversation. It is possible that you're not able to convince the individual 100%. And then you put in place the policy because you feel the policy is important and it's an important step and it cannot wait till everybody is 100% convinced. I still feel having that conversation is better than not having that conversation because at least you had that conversation. See, a circular from top management is like it's like a recipe, is like a very, is just waiting to be commented upon and criticized by people in the ground level. And they're waiting to criticize how those higher ups don't understand what is happening over here and how they are thrusting things on us. I would say have that conversation, even if everybody is not convinced. See, we are not talking about a homogeneous group over here. Maybe out of 100 people, 20 people will be convinced. There'll be 40 or 50 who are fence sitters, and maybe there will be another 20, 25 who are completely, till they retire, they will not change their mind. But it still reduces your pool of 100 to only 20. If instead of that, you were to send a circular and implement it by a fiat from the top, then those 20 vocal fellows would have persuaded the remaining 80 and you would have 100 people against you.
Yeah. So one's a sure shot recipe for disaster, and here you're trying to kind of make sure there is some entry point that you can navigate through.
Yes. And they may give you some ideas. See, the other thing is they will give you some ground level ideas, which you will never be able to understand. So I remember I once spoke to an organization about the kind of empowerment that they gave to their workers. And that organization said that whenever we buy a piece of machinery, we ensure that not just the engineers travel to the country where they are buying the machine from. So if the machine is being bought from Germany and got to India, they make sure that the workmen, people who are going to work on the machine, people who are going to use the nuts and bolts to tighten the nuts and bolts to repair the machine, they also travel along with the engineers to procure the machine. Now, why do they do that? Because there are some things that those people know at the ground level about maintaining a machine that an engineer will never know. Similarly, the person whose D&I agenda it is to get more women into the sales force will never know certain ground level realities of the sales force.
Right, right,
So
right. That,
within their discontent lie the seeds of your future investments and initiatives.
yeah, that's well said, Zubin. We have a few more questions. Shambhavi, do you want to kind of
Sure.
take?
Malvika asks, what are your thoughts on setting DEI targets at the workplace? Do you think they are counterintuitive and impact the acceptability on ground of genuinely beneficial policies? And she expands, she says, shouldn't the policies themselves be so strong and healthy that they help organizations get a better balance of maybe representation and identities?
So, targets, there is one theory of motivation called the goal setting theory, which says that you set a specific measurable goal and it increases your probability of achieving that goal. So in that sense, setting targets are useful because they provide you an indicator for how you are progressing. Having said that, if your organization is made up of intelligent people, which most organizations are, it makes sense to involve them in the setting of those targets. Because if there is a buy-in, uh, maybe the target will be 20-30% less than what you would have set on your own, because they will bring in the ground level realities. It is still better than having a target set from top down, so that at least people own the target. So the target, I think, helps in anything. But at the same time, some of the other stuff that we said also needs to be done. It's not just the target which will work. The target will be an enabler. It will tell us how well we are doing. It will give us feedback on our progress. And it gives us a focus to channelize our energies.
And I think there's also this bit about when you have, this is a slightly different way you talk about the critical mass theory, right? When you have a certain set of people coming into the organization, it also creates a momentum for some of that initiative.
Absolutely.
So that's the other reason why target setting is so important.
Absolutely.
Moving on to the next question from Vishal. Vishal says, shareholders usually push for a D&I target, although it is very important, usually the numbers count one diversity, gender. Is there a way to do dialogues or get a buy-in for inclusive diversity, which is perhaps difficult to quantify?
I'm not sure how that will happen. I think we have to move in steps, and gender diversity is the most visible and most basic kind of diversity that organizations start with. But having said that, it is important that other kinds of diversity also come in terms of, uh, as I mentioned earlier, other demographics, psychographics, cognitive diversity, ideological diversity. All this has to also then follow in its way. It may not be as easily measurable, but it can come in over a period of time. Maybe you start with those things which are easy and simple to measure and then move to more subtle kinds of diversity.
Mm. I think one of the things that we are seeing, Zubin, is in terms of the demographic diversity, especially in the US, they've obviously, beyond the gender, they've obviously started looking at what's happening in terms of whether it's Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians and representation, and kind of overlaying the gender dimension onto these. We're also seeing, of course, looking at, inclusion of the LGBTQI community. So those are metrics, of course, we're now definitely seeing expansion beyond just looking at men and women in the workplace. And the other bit that we're seeing in very, very progressive organizations is, of course, they're also starting to think about, what does it mean in terms of our competencies and competency assessment and how that's measuring sort of cognitive, to some extent, the issues around cognitive kind of diversity, like, but in small ways. But I think that's the other bit where we're kind of thinking whether, people are saying that are we actually encouraging people to think differently from just one standard way of thinking, and again, that in some ways may not be as clearly measurable, as that as the question was, that it's a shift, I think, in terms of a journey, as you were saying, that all organizations are on a journey in terms of looking at their DI cycle.
I think one of the other shifts which will be welcome for the D&I agenda is uh, the shift from credentials to skills and competencies. So organizations are moving out of looking at people only based on the degree or where they studied,
Yeah.
and trying to look at the skills that they have, and becoming more liberal when it comes to those credentials. Now, that
Mm.
again is likely to help because that allows us to tap into populations which may not have had access to the kind of education where they normally go to for recruitment, etc. And that gives a wider pool for organizations to recruit from.
Institutional bias is very hard to break, and I know even from our own experience of our own hiring, we found it quite difficult to break that institutional bias. But one of the things that I found very, very reaffirming is in terms of some of the tech companies, because they want that skilling, that
Yes,
as long as you have your certification and as long as you can code or whatever you need to, you're on. It doesn't matter, whether you've now gone to an IIT or not. And I
correct.
think that's a significant move that we're seeing now.
Yeah.
I mean, we just spoke about demographics and representation, which is very tied into the question that Zarka asks. She asks, how diverse should an organization be in terms of demographics? Because often we see that just having representation of diverse identities doesn't translate to inclusion. So, I mean, how would you answer that question?
So I think I don't have any numerical answer for that. I think it's a mountain with no top. So we keep getting more and more sensitive to different things. And as society becomes more sensitive, organizations also reflect that sensitivity that has manifested in society. So it's important for an organization to keep its eyes and ears open, look at its current state. Every organization is different. The nature of work is different. Their reality is different. The existing group of people who make up that organization is different. You know what is the ideal. You need to be fair. You need to be inclusive. You need to accommodate people from different kinds of demographic, psychographic, cognitive backgrounds. See what is the next step that you need to take and move to that step. So I don't think there is any absolute thing. It's just about moving and being more and more inclusive going forward. Now, this is going to have several benefits. So there was a book in which I read that if you need to explain to your people why diversity is important, then there is some problem in your organization. So there are several studies which talk about the benefits of diversity, not just from ethical point of view, which is the basic reason why organizations want to do this, but also from a pragmatic point of view. And it has to definitely reflect what realities are there in society.
A follow-up question to that from Zarka. She's asking, how does the organization then measure the success of its diversity initiatives?
So one is, of course, you have set your goals and to what extent you've been able to move up to those goals. Second is there are several tools available in which you collect feedback from people who are within the organization and try to understand to what extent the organization has equitable employment practices, to what extent the organization has been able to integrate the differences that are there in people, to what extent are people involved in day-to-day decision making. So there are tools to measure that. It's something like a engagement survey in that you put in these questions, and that will give you an understanding to what extent people feel that they are part of decision making. So when we talk about inclusion, one is the diversity and inclusion bit. But let us say there is an organization which is made up of members of just one group. Even there, people may not feel included. So in many ways, the conversation of inclusion goes beyond diversity also. It is possible to have a homogeneous organization where there's very little diversity, and there may also be very little inclusion. It is possible for people to feel unincluded. If your manager is extremely autocratic, makes decisions on his or her own, does not care for you, you don't feel any meaning in your work, you don't feel that you contribute much to the organization, you may still feel unincluded. So inclusion is an imperative even without diversity.
The next question is from Atma. They ask, where should an organization start when it's highly skewed in terms of diversity and does not even have a single woman CXO? And the challenges are that it's in the renewable energy sector and have sites in remote locations with round-the-clock operations.
Atma, I don't have a ready answer for you. As I said, it's important for people to sit together, talk about the need for diversity, and come up and brainstorm with what works best for them. And set the goals for themselves, set your goals for next couple of years, and then work towards that.
And maybe one of the things, Zubin, that you said, you read that book which said, if you're having a conversation why diversity matters, there's something wrong. But maybe there's a little bit of research that people need to maybe do in those organizations in that case. Why should diversity matter? Why is it important for the renewable energy sector, maybe, right, in this context?
Yeah, that
and kind of have those as, useful pointers for those conversations to have, because you need sometimes you need some things for the conversation starter to have, and within that, try and have uh you know like a larger conversation with your stakeholders, whoever are your stakeholders, not only your employees, but think about who all, including your board and everybody else, because this needs a organization wide kind of an investment. So you need to have discussions with the board. uh, I don't know if shareholders is something that is that important for that organization or not, but yeah, sure, shareholders, but your employees.
We've got one more question from Nilima. Nilima asks how to drive D&I efforts in the value chain from a sustainability point of view. You can unmute yourself and expand on your question if you'd like, Nilima.
Yeah, good evening. I just remember because as far as sustainability is concerned, nowadays D&I is not only limited to the organization, but it is also applicable to your value chain.
Okay,
So
you mean the vendor?
Yeah. So as far as your organization is concerned, you can take initiatives and implement it. But for your value chain, it is not that easy to implement. So in that case, how to go forward?
Yeah, I think there again, let's say you've done a reasonably good job of implementing diversity and inclusion in your organization. Now you want to expand the initiative to your value chain. Now something similar was done in the case of environmental initiatives also, that the organization does a good job within its four walls, and then it serves as a consultant or a coach to its vendor organizations. Teams from your organization can reach out to those organizations and start those conversations within those organizations based on their realities and their goals, and then co-create the roadmap for those organizations such that they own the goals again. So rather than, again, the circular approach is not going to work, where you send a message that, within 5 years, you have to achieve these targets. Otherwise, you're no longer going to be vendors for our company. Instead of that, reach out to them, work as a coach or a consultant, and help them to move up from wherever they are. Companies did this, when it came to environment and other kind of things, quality also. Most of the automobile companies, they reached out to their ancillaries, taught them just-in-time supply chain concepts, total quality management. And today, if you look at any auto vendor, they are, as good as any world-class organization on these aspects.
I think, in that sense, it's also about distilling your own learnings into kind of saying, these are what we are actually learning from our own experience. Correct. The entire in the entire TPM, that's one of the things they've done very well in terms of kind of talking about really this is how we benefited from this.
And they have high credibility, right? Because when they talk about, they're talking from that industry, they are the customers of that product, and they can also be honest about the challenges that they face, the mistakes that they make, so that the vendor then gets a head start.
Yeah, and one of the things is that, when we started off, there was on at least on our TPM journey, there were no penalties for making mistakes. right? In terms of, being open for, because one of the things we've seen even with D&I and with vendors and the supply chain, the moment you say that there is a gap, that we're falling short, there is always a penalty that's being imposed. Now, if you can desist from imposing penalties, that will actually encourage a partnership, and an openness to kind of saying, okay, fine, what can I do? This is where I am. What can I do to kind of actually strengthen, right? And this is what we also kind of talk about. Let's not boycott a vendor or a supply chain just because they're actually not meeting the needs, right? Because often they are the ones who you really need to support, right? And they're the ones who have the most vulnerable population employed. So if you actually boycott, you're collapsing that entire kind of, supply chain. But instead of that boycott or cancel, you need to kind of create some kind of an environment support that you can actually pull them up and really continue to work with them.
Absolutely.
We'll take one final question before we have to close. Viveka asks, how must an organization ensure psychological safety amongst the groups once the hiring targets have been met?
There are a lot of things, Viveka. I don't think it is one thing, because this is such a pervasive thing to ensure psychological safety. The most important is role modeling behavior by the top management, where they demonstrate that, and don't have any backlash against people who make statements which do not fit in with the rest of the group. It's a cultural issue. And see, one of the challenges that is there in this whole psychological safety, and it is also related to empowerment at the workplace, is that we have kind of multiple generations in the workplace. There is often a generation which was brought up on authoritarian managers. And what they learned from those authoritarian managers is that the job of the manager is to think, and the job of the team is to follow. Now, that group of people who worked under those authoritarian managers are now in the senior management roles. And those habits that have been formed over years of their nurturance while they were young in the organization, those are now manifesting in their behaviors as managers, because this was what we learned how a manager should be. Now, that is often the biggest barrier, the middle management, which forms the bulk of the organization. They are usually the biggest barrier to several of these culture change initiatives. You can have a top management who understands the need for some of these things. Let us say they are enlightened and they start, being the role models. That makes it a little easier. But these people have to be worked on in terms of, some kind of a training program, some kind of a feedback, maybe some kind of even punitive action in case they are outliers, in terms of their behavior and completely out of sync with what the organization wants to achieve. I think working with that group, making them realize that, the world has changed from the time that you were, the way you were treated is not necessarily the way you need to treat others. And I think that would really work. And many organizations are doing this. They're working with the middle management team, bring in the culture change. But yeah, it's not easy to bring in this.
Yeah, in that sense, one of the things that we also kind of see is about, I mean, as you said, punitive measure. It's important to kind of say what kinds of behavior the organization will not tolerate, like
Correct.
whether it's bullying or whether it's harassment, right? Microaggressions become harder to kind of possibly, define, but, clearly bullying and workplace harassment is something that at least the organization can make explicit, saying that this is not the kind of behavior that will be acceptable, right? So in a way, people are made aware of it. The other bit, I think, which is a gendered component, one is a generational component of it, and one of the things that we see is a gendered component of it. We are also, in a way, and it's changing, it's shifting, in a way, we're also, and especially maybe our generation, brought up in a kind of leadership style which is masculine in a particular way, right? And border on sort of toxic masculinity. at a certain place. Also to kind of reflect on that, right? What does these kinds of our leadership behavior, and what do you mean? And when I mean masculine, doesn't mean that only men follow it, right? It
Yeah.
just means that a particular kind of leadership style, and I'm not saying masculine leadership is bad, but when it comes to toxic masculinity, to kind of reflect on that, and what it does for the individual as well. And often we forget that there is something that's happening to the individual also constantly, who's always angry, who's always kind of looking down and telling you to kind of do in a particular way. There's a huge stress that person carries, and we don't often talk about that.
Absolutely. There are studies done on that as well about individuals who are, high on power and are abusive. They bear the cost also of their abusive behavior. Not just the victim, but also the perpetrator has to bear the cost in terms of health and well-being.
I mean, I think an overall shift that's happening is on the focus on health and well-being, right? Also, Zubin, that's, I think, also helping organizations think about psychological safety in a much more holistic manner.
I think one of the things that some organizations have done is that wherever there is this kind of harassment and bullying,
Hmm.
to put in place some kind of helplines, to have an independent agency to investigate those issues of bullying, because it's not easy for an employee to come out and complain.
Hmm.
So we are talking about extreme cases, and there are many extreme cases in our context, which we hear informally, people telling us, etc. So have that kind of a group of people, maybe an agency, which receives those complaints, investigates that, and then you take prompt action against the perpetrator, irrespective of what their performance may be, because typically these people are the high performers, and they are the do what it takes to get the job done kind of folks. And that's where the top management has to demonstrate some spine and
Right.
take that action. Many often we see that there are these kind of systems, but top management doesn't take action. In that case, then of course you will not be able to uh, bring in the change. Sometimes if you don't have these formal systems, informal conversations can work. So skip level meetings where you have informal conversations, you just chat. So, what time do you go home regularly? How does it work? And you talk with sufficient number of people, you can kind of understand what kind of a manager they have. And then coach that manager.
Yeah.
Talk to that manager that why is it that your people seem to be so scared of you all the time? Why is it that they seem to be so inhibited in your presence? Have
Yeah.
those kind of conversations, coach that person to try out a different style. Uh, I think those kind of things may help. And
Yeah.
parallelly, we need to work on the people also. They also need to then slowly start being more proactive, taking initiative, etc. So it's not all a one-way street. It has to work at 2 or 3 different levels. But it's not an
Absolutely.
easy thing to bring in this kind of a
No,
culture.
that's one of the toughest, right? And
It is.
kind of, and it's a good barometer for how good your organization is in terms of organizational culture. If it's managing to create that psychological safety for all employees. And coaching is I think it's such an important bit, and often underinvested in many organizations. So, yeah.
Coaching is also expensive.
Yeah,
Now with AI coming in, if we have AI-driven coaches, perhaps it can be more
you make
widely applied.
some of our lives, some of our work redundant. Kind of, yeah, but this is amazing. I think we're handing back over to Shambhavi. We're, I think, at the end of our discussion today.
Yes, I think that's a good note to close the conversation. It's always helpful to think about what we can do individually and collectively to foster a change in culture, in systems. So thanks a lot to both of you for driving this conversation, for sharing all of your insights. I would also like to thank the audience and everyone who tuned in for sending such engaging questions. And I think that made this conversation very rich and very interactive. Thanks a lot to Saurav and Preeti for effortlessly interpreting this session. I really appreciate all the work that you do for us. And once again, thanks for joining. If you have any comments or suggestions related to Circle Back, please feel free to write to us. You can write to us on the email that I have pasted in the chat box. You can also find previous Circle Back conversations on our YouTube. Again, the link for that is in the chat box. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the new year with an all new Circle Back.